So we have a great guest with us today for Unmuted with Marsha, and this is probably not a name you've heard every day, but a lot of days. And Brendan Carr, who is the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, is with us today. And you know what is so interesting to me, Mr. Chairman, is as I talk about the FCC and the litany of acronyms that we have, people will say, well, what's the FCC? The Federal Communications Commission. Well, what do they do? So what is your elevator speech on what the FCC actually does on a daily basis and how it affects Tennesseans and all Americans?
Well, thank you so much, Senator, for having me on. It's great to be with you, and thank you so much for your leadership in the Senate and before that in the House. I've had the chance to visit Tennessee with you a number of times. There's a lot of, kitchen table issues that come right out of the FCC. Rural broadband is number one. We play a significant role in making sure that every single community in the country has access to high-speed internet, whether it's permitting reform to get these fiber builds going or it's more spectrum for 5G and mobile broadband. We also do a lot of other things in terms of regulating the media sector. We license broadcasters, and we engage in a lot of reforms to help make sure our space economy is going. There's this new generation of low Earth orbit satellites that people know about that's bringing really next generation connectivity to communities across the country. And then telehealth, too. We've played a significant role in supporting the rollout of telehealth services. So when people can't necessarily get to a hospital or a physical brick and mortar facility, they can get high quality care delivered directly to them on a smartphone or an iPad. So there's a lot that the FCC does in the communications sector that impacts people's daily lives. And obviously, you know it better than anybody from the leadership positions you have in Senate Commerce Committee and overseeing the FCC. So thanks for everything that you're doing.
Well, we do oversee the FCC, and we think that having access to 21st century technology is something that determines how communities are going to be able to access 21st century economic development and education and healthcare and law enforcement. So, as you said, it does touch everyone's lives. And in addition to that, you all give grants that are there. A lot of our communities, I've had some in this week, they've talked about grants for broadband and for healthcare access. So how do you all administer that grant pool?
Yeah, that's right. There's one program called the Universal Service Fund. It's a $9 billion a year fund, and we break it up between subsidizing internet builds in rural parts of the country where there wouldn't be a private sector business case for it. There's a low-income component of that. There's a telehealth component of it. There's also a portion of it that goes to schools and libraries. And that's in addition to, a lot of people may have heard about this, there's a Commerce Department program called BEAD. It's a $42 billion program that was actually started by President Biden. And over 1,000 days, that $42 billion program, which was intended to connect millions of Americans, didn't end up turning even a single shovel's worth of dirt because that program got sidetracked by progressive policy goals, a DEI agenda, and all sorts of other sort of, social policies that held it back. But thankfully now with Secretary Lutnick in place, I think we can get that program back on track and do our job of making sure that every single American has a fair shot at next-gen connectivity.
Well, I have a lot of counties in Tennessee that are hopeful that you can get that BEAD program back on track because the promise was there, all the big hype, but then there were so many qualifiers on the DEI and the ESG and different things that people couldn't qualify and use the money.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so it really was a false hope. Well, in addition, you all look at how people use the airwaves in one regard. And before the Grammys took place, I sent you a letter. Idea came to me from, and the request actually came to me from musicians and band members, people that are on the road a lot. And it was about what they consider to be kind of modern-day payola, with entertainers being required by radio stations, which, by the way, are using federal spectrum, and there is not compensation for that. Kind of talk through that issue a little bit, because in Tennessee, we've got a lot of people that play in bands and spend a lot of time on the road.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your leadership. Since I became chair of the FCC, one of the very first letters I got was you raising this issue, and it's a core issue for so many people. So it's called payola, and this was a big issue back in the 90s and the 2000s. It sort of went away, but now it is rearing its head back. And the issue is a radio station can't sort of secretly exchange free performances from musicians or bands in exchange for better airplay on the radio. And the evidence we've seen suggests that in fact has been happening significantly. So there'll be a local music festival, and the radio station will say, well, you big performing band, come play for me. I'm not going to pay you. Maybe you get your expenses, and that's it. In exchange, we'll give you better airplay on our radio station, and therefore you'll make money that way. That's illegal. That's a payola scheme by definition. And I think for a long time, the FCC sort of looked the other way on that issue. And thanks to your leadership, we put out an enforcement advisory immediately. And I've also launched a specific investigation into a chain of radio stations that may be violating the FCC's payola rule. This is really meaningful to artists and musicians to make sure that they're compensated adequately for their time and their work.
Well, and I think to some of the band members, for the big name musicians, that this is something. Expenses is one thing, but payment for the show is another.
Yep, exactly.
And so there are some concerns around that, and I thank you for taking that issue up and giving it a good hard look. I want to ask you about a blog post where you said we are too dependent on GPS and we'll be exploring alternatives. Talk to people about that, because so many of us get in the car, we put in the address, and off we go. So, as I tell my grandkids, I'll say, look out the window. Learn to look for landmarks, things of that nature. So talk a little bit about that thread of thought.
Yeah. Well, I'm old enough to remember when we go on road trips, you would say, did you remember to print out the MapQuest directions? And of course, now right on our smartphone, we have applications that take us wherever we want to go. So the U.S. GPS system is integral to our economy, to our national security. Everything from precision agriculture runs off it. And the key thing that GPS does is it's called PNT, precision navigation and timing. But it's a vulnerable system because it is simply a single satellite system. If anything were to happen in that sort of orbit of the satellites, or we've seen a real big uptick in jamming around the world in conflict zones and otherwise, that makes GPS vulnerable. So what we're doing at the FCC is we're seeking comment on a way to bolster that GPS system with potentially terrestrial alternatives. Broadcasters, for instance, may have an ability to help here. There's lots of other technologies out there that could play a role. And so we are starting the process of looking at how we can bolster GPS, because it's too important to our economy and national security to have it be vulnerable and be a single point of failure on PNT. But stepping back, it's part of a broader agenda we're running at the FCC. We've been there for a little over 50 days at this point, and I got to tell you, the feeling in D.C. is like nothing I've seen before. President Trump comes in, and most people come in and they think, well, we can turn the ship of government a degree here or 2 degrees there, and that's the best case scenario. And President Trump and the Senate leadership has decided to reject that idea, and we are really embarking on a wholesale change of the way Washington works. And we're sort of energized at the FCC. There's a new vigor with what we're doing. We're pushing hard on spectrum. We're pushing hard soon on infrastructure and permitting reform. And there's really a sort of a new, energy and vigor in D.C., and it's great.
I so agree with you. People are so energized about the things that they see happening and exploring alternatives like you're talking about, where you're going to bring some diversity into that delivery system. Is the type thing we ought to be doing. And one of the things that has come up this week that a couple of people have asked me about is spectrum, and why we need to auction spectrum, because we have more wireless devices that are out there. And I think many times that many of us don't appreciate the fact that we would not have as much radio transmission, we wouldn't have as much internet, we wouldn't enjoy some of these apps and platforms we enjoy without having spectrum that delivers the broadband and the speeds that we need. So spectrum is kind of what underpins that. So spectrum auctions are important.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And thank you so much for your leadership on this. You've been leading the way. You have legislation, a spectrum pipeline bill that you've been doing. Most people don't think about this. They think when they turn their smartphone on, they just expect it to work. Maybe they think about it working on magic or pixie dust, but it's wireless spectrum. It's this invisible, limited, scarce natural resource. And the way that America's mobile wireless industry has succeeded over the years is because the FCC auctions the airwaves and makes more spectrum available. And that's how you've got 5G on your phone. That's how we went from 3G to 4G. Is we had this constant pipeline of spectrum so that commercial users could have it and increase speeds and increase capacity, unlock that app economy. And unfortunately, the last 4 years under President Biden, we fell into this deep malaise when it came to spectrum. And all of a sudden, we have China and other countries that have leaped out to a massive lead on the United States in terms of the availability of what we call sort of this core mid-band spectrum. We are so far behind China right now. It's a problem because, one, when you free up spectrum, it drives down the price of your wireless service, so it's deflationary, which is a great thing right now. Two, it puts the wind at the back of America and our allies because when new technologies are being developed, when capital is flowing, it's going to go to the countries that have more spectrum available. And so if we don't move now and catch up to China, we're at a real risk, particularly with AI. AI is the next big sort of development in technology. We want it to work on our smartphones. That requires a lot more capacity, which means a lot more spectrum. But to your point, the FCC's Spectrum Auction Authority lapsed a couple of years ago.
Which was astounding to many of us.
Truly.
We couldn't believe it.
Truly. And we just lost all momentum on it. Now, the good news is we have a playbook that works. When President Trump came in 2017, we were in the same situation. The spectrum cupboards were bare. We were behind China. He leaned into it. You lean into it. And we caught up to China. Biden came in, and all of a sudden, we just made no forward progress on spectrum. And so we're back in that same position of being behind China. But once again, President Trump is prioritizing this. You're leading on it. Chairman Cruz is leading on it. I'm confident that we'll get the FCC's Spectrum Auction Authority back. It's great for our economy. It's great for national security. You can use it for deficit reduction because when we auction spectrum, it's hundreds of billions of dollars that can go either to the Treasury or to other significant national priorities.
Yes, gives us the ability to offset tax cuts so we can save the American people money, leave more of that money in their pocket. So I know that over at the FCC, you all are working quite a bit with the tech companies. Yeah. And as we look at some of their practices in the virtual space, for our audience that is concerned about the overreach of big tech, how do you all step into that?
Yeah. Well, this is another issue where you were out front years and years ago. I think all the way back in 2020, you introduced a legislation to reform Section 230. And for those that don't remember, Section 230 is the liability protection that is in the Communications Act that big technology companies have relied on to censor. So they're censoring not just with the scope of their First Amendment rights, whatever those may be, but with these special bonus protections. And the reality is courts have read immunities into Section 230 that Congress never put into the law. And so when you step back and think about where we've been over the last 4 or 5 years, Americans have lived under this wave of censorship. You were silenced on social media just for expressing a divergent political view, religious view, scientific view, trying to have a conversation about where COVID originated. You got shut down. And so one of the things that we are doing and that President Trump is doing is restoring free speech, because when people feel free to speak about words, they feel free to speak about ideas, and that leads to innovation. I think that's part of why you feel this wet blanket lifting over the country is people feel like they can talk again. Now, there's some companies like X, when Elon Musk bought it, that immediately stood in the breach and said, we're not doing the censorship thing. Others, like Zuckerberg at Meta, has sort of come along recently and is now taking a stand for free speech. But Google and others still have a ways to go. And so I think whether it's Congress through Section 230, which tracks some of the legislation you've done, or potentially there's a role for the FCC because Section 230, again, is in the Communications Act. And so we could step in and say, look, here's what Congress meant when they passed 230. Leave other people's speech up on your platform, no problem. But if you're going to censor people, if you're going to take down speech, you shouldn't do so with sort of this expanded reading of Section 230. So I think that's something that's interesting for us to look at, for Congress to look at, because we have to get back to free speech in this country.
You know, I am so concerned about what happened through censorship and people feeling fearful of speaking up and expressing their opinion. And for years, I have had a phrase I used regularly, that our nation has stayed free because we believe in robust, respectful, bipartisan debate, that everyone has the right to express their opinion. And we want to make certain that we preserve that right. So we appreciate all the work that you are doing on the airwaves and with looking at what is happening with communications and those delivery systems. And I will say, too, especially when it comes to spectrum, getting those auctions back in gear. Your leadership is so appreciated, and working to put President Trump's agenda in place is so appreciated. And our audience can find you over at the Federal Communications Commission.
That's right, yeah, and Brendan Carr, FCC on X. I'm on there probably too often, but people can find me there as well.
Awesome. That sounds great. And we appreciate, Mr. Chairman, that you would take your time and come join us. And always to our audience, you will find me on social media at Marsha Blackburn.